Professor of International Relations at the University of Westminster, London. And obviously you can see his very recent book, obviously published just coming out in July. Good, good. The International State. As you can see, international state building, the rise of post-liberal governance, and this year you'll have another book on a different project. Okay, it's last year. Hollow Hegemony, Rethinking Global Politics, Power and Resistance. So from rethinking the concept and the idea of Europe, we're now coming back to basically Europe as an actor outside the borders of EU, namely Southeast Europe. So we are coming. Wow. Well, all right. Well, then I will leave David to you know.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So I think I want to talk about paradoxes, paradigms, and politics. And I know I can't see Professor Johan Babic, but he made some very interesting points this morning about as he told it, about the paradoxical nature of the European Union. And he said that it was quite amazing that the EU was the fastest and most focused endeavour of integration without force. And in fact he said it was amazing. He said it was an amazing phenomenon and that it needed explanation. And that it seemed that there was a paradox in that the EU was an amazing phenomenon that seemed to have transformed what we understand by politics in Western Europe and seemed to be transforming things that it touched, like Eastern Europe. And in fact, you can't really engage with the European Union without it seeking to transform you. A trade agreement, they'll say, fine, trade agreement good, but let's bring in these human rights conditions and good governance conditions and other things. It seems that the EU doesn't exist in a way without being on a transformative mission and a process of change. And people so far have touched upon it. But the paradox seems to be that the EU, especially the EU as we understand it since the end of the Cold War, has been a tremendously important actor. And yet, paradoxically, it doesn't seem very clear. There seems to be a problem that we have something so important, so influential, and yet it seems very difficult for us to grasp. And what I thought I might try and talk about, only briefly, because we may want to discuss it, is partly why is there that paradox? And maybe that paradox has a broader basis than just the nature of the EU and looking at the EU's internal mechanisms. Maybe there's something more paradoxical in terms of our inability to grasp and understand the dynamic of the European Union. Whether that dynamic is an integration dynamic, which again seems peculiar. Why should these states, the states of Western Europe, want to give up their sovereignty, if that's indeed what they are doing? Why should states want to give up their own sovereignty to the European Union? So the integration dynamic in itself seems a peculiar one, let alone the enlargement dynamic, which mainly we've been sort of discussing today, of what are the limits to this endless process of transformation that the European Union is forced to do, or that we're forced to think about when we think about the European Union. And so, I want to look at that paradox, and within that, think about, as the title of our conference says, about searching for a new paradigm. And I think, I don't know, I didn't speak to Petter about, I did speak to him, but not about the nature of the title, but it seems that it's not that the EU is searching for a new paradigm, maybe, but maybe that we need to search for a new paradigm to overcome that paradox, our inability to see the wood for the trees, our inability to see or to understand what this thing is called the European Union. And today there's been some attempts to, well, today I think it's maybe indicated that maybe we need a new paradigm. That on one level, some people have said that the EU, what drives it, what's its dynamic, it's a peace project. The EU is the biggest and most successful peace project that's ever existed. And, well, you know, we might want to think about that. Is peace, whatever that might be, explaining the nature of the dynamism of the EU? Why is it that the dynamic nature of the EU was only really apparent after the end of the Cold War? Why is it that so long after war within Europe, within the members of the EU, that they suddenly wanted to do much more integration? You think, if it was like a peace project, maybe it could have run out of steam in terms of the internal appeal of the European Union for its members. But instead, the further away from war and conflict the EU has been, the more dynamic there is, the more appeals there are to force through this transitionary nature and to further integrative processes. So you may think it's a peace project. On the other hand, other people, early this morning, maybe it could be an economic project. Maybe we could understand the European Union in a more realist type of way, that states within the EU needed to collaborate more to compete in terms of global markets. Maybe it's an economic project. Other people have said it's a moral project. The EU captures within it, you know, a Kantian imperative to, you know, a teleological view about peace and transformation and harmony and cosmopolitanism. And we can understand that imminent drive and think about when that drive might stop, at what level of cosmopolitan integration. I don't know if those things work for you, those frameworks and those paradigms of understanding, then that's fine. But I'm not sure, personally, that they necessarily work. And I think that the solution to the paradox, our inability to really put our finger on the EU, but the more we study it, the more it gets blurred and shifts. And the way out of some of our old paradigms is to understand the EU and the need for the EU as reflecting something quite different about the world that we live in, and about how that world might be understood and how it might be governed. And I sort of think of that difference in terms, I use this term post-liberal or post-liberalism. But any term is only as good as the content that it conveys. Well, I want to argue that there's something about the EU which is at war against our traditional assumptions of modernity. And those assumptions of modernity are normally seen as liberal democratic assumptions about how we legitimise power, how we understand the operation of the state in relationship to society. And I want to suggest that the EU is a response to some of the problems of modernity, in the sense of the processes of legitimisation, the processes of understanding how governments might govern, have changed. And I want to argue that they've changed because the content of liberal modernity, which to my mind, crudely put, because we want to have some discussion, the content was given to modern processes by popular participation, by mass engagement in politics. And I want to argue that it was people, really, that enabled governments to govern, and people's engagement in a political process, and social and political contestation over the nature of that process. And I want to suggest that today there's a process of disengagement, that politics and traditional liberal forms and frameworks of politics don't have very much content, and that the withering away of that social and political content results in ways of governing which don't really work on liberal assumptions. They don't work on liberal assumptions about democracy and majoritarian rule. They don't work on assumptions that privileged the human subject at the centre, the human subject as an autonomous, rational and moral subject. If you think about essential liberal modernity, the state was legitimised on the basis of people's autonomy, whether you look at social contract theory or whatever. The market worked on the basis of our ability to make choices and be informed and exchange and all those other things. Now, obviously that's a liberal narrative, a liberal story, but it was a way of understanding why states were separate from markets. It was a way of understanding how governments might govern. And I want to suggest that today we have a different set of narratives. Rather than autonomy being the founding point for legitimacy, we have a view that autonomy is the problem that needs to be resolved. We have a view that autonomy and freedom and democracy are the problems. We have a different framework. And in order for democracy to work, see, before we had an assumption that we were capable of democracy. This is just one example. Today, to make democracy work, people, or the voters, or the citizens, need to be democratised. They need to be educated. There seems to be a problem with autonomy, which we didn't have before, because autonomy was the basis of a liberal understanding of rule. In the same way, just one more example, we had an idea of a rule of law. Now, we called it rule of law in liberal modernity because it derived from legal subjects, from citizens. We consented to it. It wasn't a rule of law because it could be backed by police and courts and people could be put in prison. They had that sort of law, I don't know, under Stalinism or under military dictators in Latin America. We had a very liberal understanding of a rule of law. But I would suggest that that rule of law is a very different one to our post-liberal rule of law. The rule of law that the European Union might export to other countries. The rule of law that says that law comes before citizens. That institutions make the citizen rather than the citizen making the state. Now we could trace those ideas, that critique of a universal idea of an autonomous subject. We can trace them through the 20s in terms of economic theory and critiques of rational choice. We can trace them through critical sociological theories, which equally undermine a universal idea of the subject. But all I'm suggesting is that those ideas today are dominant. Those ideas that say autonomy is the problem that needs to be resolved, those are dominant today because there's a real material basis for it. The withdrawal of people from politics removes the basis on which we had those freedoms, on the basis on which sovereignty and self-government seem to be important. Today, if a state is sovereign, it's an argument for intervention. It says, no, this is really dangerous in a globalised world. Surely that sovereignty needs intervention of institutions. If there's this democracy without a framework beyond it, we would argue that that is a problem that needs intervention. It's like an inversion of a liberal framework. Previously there was autonomy, and that was the reason why there shouldn't be intervention. Today, autonomy equals intervention, and a need to intervene and to shape those choices. So, I want to suggest that the dynamic behind the European Union is a way of governing which is very different. It's a way of governing, and government becomes governance. It's about frameworks and processes and institutions that enable us to make the right decisions. In that framework of the EU's governance, not only is the autonomous subject problematised, but also states. Any focus of power, where there's responsibility and direction, that also becomes problematic and dangerous. And the model for the European Union, I would suggest we'd probably find in post-war Germany, where again the population were problematised and the state was seen as problematic. And the its power should be dispersed, that the state shouldn't have goals and direct. Instead, the state should be a facilitator for society, that the bank should be independent from government, that the courts should have more authority. Though that post-war German framework of the restriction of autonomy and subjectivity that was seen as an exception now has become the norm and the rule and the basis on which the European Union's institutions and structures are managed. And I would suggest that the drive to generalise those institutions stems from the problems that governments have in relating to their own societies with a disengagement from politics and political contestation. And that's why it seems peculiar. It seems peculiar because there isn't a popular dynamic behind EU integration. It's led by elites. It's led by political elites who want to give up their sovereignty when it seems that there's no real pressure on them to do that. And I want to suggest that that's because politics and political contestation have been hollowed out, and the hollowing out of politics has left the frameworks of administration and of management, but deprived them of content. And that really is what drives the EU, and that's what the European Union exports as well. And I think that export of the death of politics, understanding the European Union's dynamic as an anti-political dynamic, it's not a peace project, it's an anti-politics project. But I suggest that's not because the European Union has a secret plan, they want to depoliticise the world, but it's forced upon the European Union, and the popularity of the European Union is also its promise of an escape from politics. It makes it very popular with elites that don't have very clear programmes and very clear relations with their own societies, but I don't think it's something that we should see as a positive, something that should be celebrated. So I might stop there and see what people might think.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for bringing out some very interesting and in a way provocative and I'm sure there will be comments and questions. So let's start with that. Yeah.
I like what you said very much, and let me try to support it in a broader context. Actually, it seems to me that in some sense you're right, that we are simply incapable of understanding what I call mega surprises in recent history. There's been a series of mega surprises in recent history due to various factors, and we'll come to that a little bit later. One of them is, of course, the European Union, the success, and the crisis and limits and everything else. The second is, of course, something absolutely unprecedented in history. A great empire with a big military, political, economic, ideological bloc around it, which this empire controlled, i.e. the Soviet Union, Communist Eastern Europe, and the Warsaw Bloc. Dissolved peacefully, more or less, without a single shot being fired, due to various factors, including an enormous big surprise, which was Gorbachev, in some sense an accident in history, completely out of the tradition of the Soviet leaders, who of course would have given their power to defend the system, let alone some more conventional power. And then we had communist capitalism in China, absolutely unprecedented, combination of communism and politics, and capitalism in economics. We've seen recently Putin as a surprise, meaning re-rise of Russia as a big power. Everybody thought that they were completely down, and I could continue on and on with that. And the conclusion, which I would support that conclusion, is actually that in some sense, a basic social thought, including scientific social thought, is in deep crisis in the sense that it is simply incapable to paradigms to understand these phenomena.
Yeah, do you want to take any more questions? Or
Yeah. Should we collect the questions? Okay.
My first question is, how do you understand liberal governance? So, do you understand by liberal the philosophical concept of liberalism or a political concept? And that's frequently an issue of confusion, especially when the political concept of liberalism is concerned. In the US, the association is with those political parties that are, or those political movements which are on the left of the center. In Europe, the European continent, it's the opposite. But is it such a concept, or is it a philosophical concept? Because that affects your argument, in my opinion. What you say, and I like also what, how you phrased it, that the EU is an anti-politics project. That is actually the greatest compliment for the European Union, apart from what I said in my presentation, that you can give, because the next step in the moral development of humankind is to bring to our consciousness that this anti-politics project ought to be a moral project. So this is exactly that step. First, an anti-politics project, a negative definition of EU governance, and then the next step would be then, and when I say next step, I'm talking about the far history, the far future. So, in fact, it seems to me that what you are saying is in fact in line with the view of the European Union as a possible moral project, something that might go in the direction of a moral project, but that you're also talking about this intermediary stage of the development of the European Union, possible development of the European Union. So that's it.
Joshua?
Great presentation, thanks. Very positive. In your description of the EU, there's a lot of structure and not a lot of agency. There's a bit of a tendency to anthropomorphise the European Union as an actor in a way that is just not really the temple, given that it's a system of multiple presidents, multiple institutions, multiple veto points, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to just push you a bit further on that, because if what you're saying is right, and obviously these are plausible claims about the way in which certain systems of governance beyond the state are contributing to what I guess you see as negative developments in relation to a possible, radical democratization process, then I think it would be helpful if you could identify, where one could push back against that in a useful way.
Yeah.
So I think the problem of the EU and what it represents, to take the questions in reverse order, is that it's about a lack of agency. It's the inability of us to think positively about the future, to think and organise collectively. That inability, it's like governments are more and more just like us as individuals. They are observers or lobbyists, and they think about values and morals rather than actually intervening in the external world and shaping it. Today we live in a world where everything seems out of control, and we call that subjectivity, that perception, we call it globalisation. The world is suddenly globalised, and therefore there's no causal relationship between means and ends. Therefore, even like traditional frameworks of knowledge are problematized and seem to hold us back. We live in a world where the human, things that we thought were good about the human are just, we understand now, are just hubristic. These were just illusions and narratives that power told us to entrap us, and now we're going to free ourselves with an inability to organise collectively, or to be able to think, or to be able to really act instrumentally. And that's celebrated if you're more of a radical post-structuralist thinker. That's the alternative. Except that's the reality, it's not really the alternative. I want to argue that that lack of agency is what drives the European Union. The inability of traditional centres of power to say that they have power, to take responsibility and to act, means that power is always shifted somewhere else. And the EU is just one example of that. It's not that the EU sit around planning how to control Eastern Europe. If they did, I think it would be a different world anyway. It's the inability to project aims and to control that creates this discourse where the EU says, and that reflecting broader trends, we don't have the power, we're just here for you, you're our partners, you're leading these things, we're here to empower you, to capacity build you, you have to own these things, you have to make the right decisions, you have to help yourselves. That's the way power expresses itself, in this terrible discourse of capacity building the other. And in doing that, to get onto your point about liberalism, and there is a morality there. It's a disgusting morality that says we have to be responsible for our own problems, and the people that we're trying to civilise or capacity build, to, why don't you choose peace instead of genocide? How can we help you to make these decisions better? And then it says, the point of that morality is that, well, they chose genocide, it's their fault, it's their problem. The EU didn't have anything to do with the breakup of former Yugoslavia. It's a way that you reject responsibility and you reject your own power, and the state or the sovereign or power disappears. That's why I'm trying to explain why there's a paradox, our inability to understand the European Union, why it seems to be a postmodern actor that's decentered and debordered. It does that because power isn't what it was, and it's forced to do that. There's a reality over determining the way that power expresses itself, is the point I was trying to make. And that's not a liberal world. A liberal world was one where humans were agents, and they could act instrumentally, and the state was important when we could act instrumentally and change our world. We struggle over state power. Now, it's embarrassing if you get elected for some reason. It's a legacy of liberalism, elections. Political parties hate elections. They haven't got a programme, there's no members, being elected doesn't really give you legitimacy. It's like, why on earth would we even have elections still? For people in power, it's like we need some experts or administrators. The idea that the state can do things and transform things has disappeared. And in that disappearance, and that's why it's sort of post-liberal, the individual is still centre. It's like a legacy of liberalism where it's the autonomous individual reduced just to a decision maker that always makes the wrong decisions, that the state needs to capacity build, to empower, to capability build. So, like an example of post-liberalism, I'm in my own country, I was in Nottingham. They have some social and economic problems, and the Labour Party MP is very radical and caring. He says, we have real problems in my constituency. The highest levels of teenage pregnancies, the lowest level of university take-up. How can I get my constituents to make better choices? How can I empower them? And then there's a discussion that maybe we should do more work at schools around emotional well-being, getting school students to pay more attention. And then other people say, well, it's too late by the time they're 5, they don't have the capabilities and that holds them back. We need to intervene when they're 3. And the MP says, if only we could intervene while they're embryos in their mother's womb and somehow give them the capabilities. And so economic and social problems that used to be political questions of macro policies that governments had control over are really posed as individual problems of morality, of education, of behaviour. It's an inversion of a liberal problematic. And the more that we cannot imagine ourselves as collective agents, the more we problematise ourselves. as individuals. You know, we're the ones with the problems. And if you think that economic and social problems can be resolved through those sort of therapeutic educational interventions, you would be wrong. But that same understanding is projected to the Balkans or the lack of economic development in sub-Saharan Africa. The solution that's projected is one of education and of individual empowerment and of poverty reduction. That's not a liberal world that seeks to transform and universal. No, the liberal world, wasn't nice, and these narratives were fictional, but, I'd rather have a fictional narrative that gave you some potential to engage and to struggle and to challenge. So the question about politically how do we grasp these things and the problems of political concepts, I think is mainly the discipline of politics and the concepts of politics meant something when they had a content. And we gave those concepts a content. It's not an academic problem. Today, when we talk, I work in a discipline of international relations, and today no one can understand what sovereignty is. Before it was very clear, it was taken for granted, states, sovereignty, that was the discipline. And it was quite clear that external intervention undermined sovereignty. Sovereignty was about political autonomy, obviously, and self-government. Today, they say, we have to intervene more to build sovereignty. There's a sovereignty gap. And that in our intervention, what we're doing is building sovereignty as a set of functions and capabilities. Even the most basic political concept has become inverted, like democracy. If you have democracy, that's a sign for external intervention. These concepts have lost their meaning because it's people and struggle that gave them a content, and that seems to have waned somewhat.
Okay, great. So we'll probably have another round of questions. And any more questions, comments?
Okay. I would just ask you a lot of questions. I would just ask you, you were talking about media. Can you just say something, what is your idea of how the norm is functioning today in today's society? Second question concerns anti-politics. What is politics?
Sorry.
There are some more questions.
Oh, yeah, go on.
Okay. And
That's the easier ones.
that's it. That's what I'm waiting for. And you talked about how law today comes before citizens. What about those who don't have the status of the citizen? How do we treat them? And I don't know if you're familiar with Giorgio Agamben's book Homo Sapiens.
Yeah.
Okay, you can connect if you like.
Yes.
For now.
Any more questions? So what is politics? That's all of it.
I think politics is a lot less than it used to be. Whether we call it ethics or something else that's taken over or colonised the political, I don't know, but the thing is that politics without struggle is less than it was. So we have the shells of politics that from where there was struggles and struggles to contain those struggles that shaped the political process, but the content seems to be much less clear. And so, when we teach political theory to our students, we go through the history of the crisis of politics and the political and politics, and it seems to speak to us in a way because it seems that elections and governments and what they do is too boring to possibly be politics. And we imagine that we can do politics somehow somewhere else, in global space or somewhere. And that doing politics in global space where there's no instrumentality and struggle for anything isn't really a solution, but the problem is there. That it seems that the frameworks of politics no longer work, and they don't. And there is a reason why they don't work. That reason isn't globalization. It's our withdrawal, our experience of defeats politically, and popular withdrawal from the public sphere. So, I don't want to get too drawn into the what is it political to do this or do that. It's like, well, so what? you know, these are things that people do, and should we encourage it or not, and how does it work, etc. I think that some of what I do worry, why I call it post-liberal, in a way, to get onto your point around Giorgio Agamben, is that today all we get is a critique of liberalism and liberal frameworks and liberal universals and liberal teleologies and all the rest of it. And probably in relation to your question, the critique of liberalism has got nothing to do with some intellectual academic study of liberal theory necessarily. It's a way that we work through our understanding of the world. It's it's a bit like when Foucault is looking at the debate around fascism and the Nazis and how we overcome it in certain ways. It's a sphere of what's he say? Anyway, a sphere of engagement. It's like an artificial thing that we critique and engage with as we try and work through, and as governments and policymakers work through why they want to reject all the things that they used to have to be responsible for. And I think that Agamben and some other post-structuralists, in their critique of liberalism, they describe very well the hollowness of being a citizen today, the arbitrary nature of intervention, and particularly at the level of international law. You know, international law has always been more of a product of power than anything else. But even domestically, it seems that law takes on a life of its own, and it seems arbitrary and to come after the event. But I think it would be wrong to generalise from today and say that law, democracy, civil rights, citizenship, that's all the discourse of power and entrapment, that we should reject all those things or see the limits of them. I think it's very important that we argue that these things actually meant something. They reflected real historical, social struggle. That the discourse of liberal universality and of our autonomy and our capacity, no, it's not like an academic invention. It reflected a real reality. And I think that the social content, as I've tried to suggest, has sort of been attenuated. And I think it's wrong to sort of intellectually naturalise that, or essentialise that, or make out that that's somehow inevitable, or somehow a product of globalisation, or the new nature of capitalism, or something. I think that to accept the death of politics, to accept the hollowing out of those concepts and those institutions is wrong. We can understand them without essentialising and rareifying and naturalising these things. Yeah. I'm not so sure about... Did I talk about norms? I think I can leave that.
Okay. If there is no any further